Hello and welcome to episode 12 of Esports Boom. As always, I'm Anton Ferraro, joined by my co-host Maurice Eisenman. And today in the studio, we have a special guest. We have Tyle Schrodt from the Electronic Gaming Federation, EGF. And he'll be on site to give his opinions on some of the stories. Tyler, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. It's always good to see both of your smiling faces, even though everyone else can't. They're beautiful.
We'll get to the point where we have the live video stream.
We're going to ask Tyler more about the EGF a little bit later in the episode, but right now we're going to kick off with a bunch of news coming out of Texas. This week we saw movement from the Cowboys, the Envious, and the MLB Rangers. Mo, let's have you cover the Cowboys first.
Yeah, so really when we look at the Cowboys, it was news that was long in the making. Complexity was bought out, or the majority stake, by Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, and real estate magnate John Joff. So the Jones family and the Joff family, they will be the majority owners. Jason Lake, the founder of Complexity, will remain a minority owner, will remain as the CEO of the company, the president of the company. And the whole organization, so the Counter-Strike team, the Counter-Strike Global Offensive team, and the Dota 2 teams will relocate to Dallas and will have their offices at the Star, which is beautiful. So this is great. I mean, look at what Dallas has right now. They have three of the hottest teams in esports. They have Optic Gaming, which arguably has the strongest brand in esports, or at least the strongest branding. They have Envious, which has some incredible teams. And then they have Complexity, which is one of the pioneers of esports and a very historical organization. So this is great for the city of Dallas.
Tyler, what are your thoughts? I know you were a big Complexity fan back in the day.
I am. For me, I think it's sort of exciting to kind of see like a brand that's been around so long that I used to watch, like even back in the days of, Source and 1.6 and things like that, finally starting to see the same level of treatment as some of the bigger brands, at least in the modern age. And so I'm really excited to kind of see what happens there, because I know between Blue Star and everything that Dallas as a city is doing, it should make it really interesting to look at. And I think one of the big things that I think is driving that is actually Frisco, because Frisco has kind of positioned it as a mission, the idea that they want to be a hub for esports, which is part of Dallas, or next to Dallas, I suppose. And they're driving from every level of esports has been super interesting. And I think that's why so much cool stuff has come out of there.
Yeah, and Dallas is actually a city with a lot of really rich esports history, going all the way back to the early CPLs.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that you mentioned in our early pre-show conversations was Blue Star, which is the Cowboys, sports entity, and they have a lot of interesting projects going on. I know that a couple of like the old MLG guys work over there. And I know that part of the reason why they were so excited to buy Complexity was that they viewed Lake as somebody who's an expert in the field. So to some degree, this was like, a brand acquisition and also a huge and important acqui-hire for them as they begin to scale their efforts into esports.
Yeah, well, I think if you kind of look at the talent pool that's available from an esports management perspective, it's still kind of shallow, right? Like, there's only so many people that started in the early 2000s that are still around or doing something that's impactful. So I think in this case, in Jason Lake, they find somebody that's almost the equivalent of like a Sundance from MLG back in the day. So I think from their perspective, in terms of investment, that is probably the best option and certainly the best for whatever they're trying to develop there.
Mo, what would you expect out of Complexity in the next 6 months?
Well, it's tough on one hand, right? Because we don't, Complexity isn't in LCS, they're not in the OWL, so they're missing out on two biggest revenue drivers in esports. However, with the Dallas Cowboys, they have an incredible partner. And they have a partner that's thinking outside of the box, that's not just thinking in the current competitive space, but is thinking about brand building. I mean, Dallas Cowboys is an incredible brand. They're thinking about youth sports. So I believe that we'll see Complexity kind of move into a different direction. I think similar to a story that we're going to talk about later, I think they're going to use Complexity as kind of their branding piece for bigger esports ventures. So perhaps you'll see youth stuff in the Dallas area and all that kind of stuff using a Complexity brand. I think we'll see Complexity move into new games, and definitely if it's not the OWL, if it's not the LCS, every future franchising spot or every future game that comes up that has a lot of potential, with the backing of the Dallas Cowboys, you can see complexity entering that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a great move by the Cowboys. I think, congrats to Lake on his big victory. I think that the other one that was interesting that came out of Dallas this week was that Optic is making some move, or rather the Rangers. And basically one of the co-owners of the Rangers created an esports holding company that now includes Optic Gaming. I think it came out that, and somebody tell me if I'm wrong, that the Rangers now own 75% of Optic, which I think it's a controlling stake. And Hector will remain as CEO, which makes sense. And Optic will be paying $13 million in order to be involved with the NALCS. I think an interesting caveat to this is that Optic is going to be in both the LCS and the OWL. And I think the only other team that's going to have that same privilege is going to be Cloud9. So it's going to be a pretty interesting brand development. I think when they came out with the Outlaws branding last week, that was some really strong branding. I think Monte Cristo had some choice comments. I see Tyler giggling in the corner.
I was thinking the relationship between Sheriff and Outlaw seemed to be a question that everyone on Twitter had.
Misconstrued. But yeah, no, I mean, Tyler, what else do you think about, the moves that the Rangers are doing out there?
I mean, I'm just as excited about this as I would be for basically any team that's now got the backing of a major sports franchise, or certainly has the staying power of someone in esports that's been around for a long time. Like, you could definitely argue that Optic's branding and just general awareness is one of the strongest in esports, a lot because of what they've done with Call of Duty and a bunch of titles that have just rabid followings. So I think at this point, as we kind of look at what's going to be the next standard for an esports team that exists in our world, whether it's with the OWL, with LCS, or any other title that comes out, I think between them and Cloud9, they're going to set a lot of the standards for what that looks like.
I mean, I see a lot of similarities with the Optic story to Echo Fox. So Echo Fox, they have Vision Esports. So it's basically they want to build a lot of companies because of their Echo Fox brand. So they utilize the Echo Fox brand and the personalities to build out their content, a studio, and all of their other different programs. So I think there's a similar thing with Optic, where they're starting this new holding company just so they can build out of the Optic brand. So they can start, let's say Optic wants to have a youth esports organization or a training program. They can then use the Optic brand, but let it be a part of the holding company. So it's really a long-term vision that I think particularly fits Optic because of their massive brand. And I think it's a very good strategy.
No, exactly. And I think one of Optic's strategies has always been to hold on to their players after they retire and, try and find a useful place for them within the company. You saw Evil Geniuses do that, but you didn't see the Evil Geniuses try and build the brand of Machine after he retired. With Optic, it's like, you have Big Timer, who's, a constant content creator. You have Maniac, who's a constant content creator. And I think that was really forward thinking of them. All right, so I think then the last story coming out of Texas was that the Dallas Fuel secured a jersey sponsor from Jack in the Box. I think this was the first non-endemic sponsor we've seen in the OWL. So it's, last week we saw Omen and HP. This week we see Jack in the Box. I also thought it was interesting that the jersey placement was so that you see the logo directly on the player POV cams. Mo, do you have any thoughts on the deal?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because Jack in the Box, as far as I know, doesn't have any history in the space. So they're unique, they're non-endemic, and it's the promise that the OWL has to deliver on, like we talked about last week. They need to bring in all these non-endemics because of the new partners, because of the franchising model. And I think it's a great start. It's good to note that it's not just Dallas Fuel. The deal also includes some activations with Envious original team, which makes sense because you have all these assets. And I'm very interested to see what other brands will see activate with all the other teams. Tyler, what do you think?
I'm mostly excited about the potential around content creation. And by that, I mean, when I looked at Arby's getting involved with the E-League, I think there was like that fast food element of like, what are you doing in esports? And are you going to be something that's a value add beyond just the dollars that you're bringing in. Then Arby's did all that crazy stuff with really strong branding, really strong content. And they really went like all out with it. And if you've ever seen like a Jack in the Box commercial, they're kind of weird. Like,
were they the guys who did that whole Danica Patrick thing?
I have no idea. All I remember is like they've got the like big round head with a long nose. And it's, like,
yeah.
So there's just like there's an inherent like weirdness to it that I think could be really intriguing for like the internet culture. But they're also like a regional brand, right? Like we don't have a Jack in the Box here as far as I have seen or known. So I think that'll be something that's kind of interesting from just like a brand awareness perspective, because their element of what the value that they're getting out of it is something that I would kind of be curious to just get their take on, given that they're not like a McDonald's or a Burger King.
They're not a McDonald's or Burger King, like you said. I mean, Dallas Fuel is going to be Dallas team, right? So that makes sense. But on the other side, global audience. And it's very interesting that a Jack in the Box, which is such a regional company, decides to be the title sponsor.
So, I mean, it kind of speaks to the OWL's regionality thing, where it's like, yes, they are a global league, but they're also hyper-local. So it's like, by having these local teams, they are able to, target these regional places. And I can't help but think that, the moment you had Arby's come in here, the moment you had Chipotle come in here, the marketing managers or the marketing directors for every single one of these QSRs was scratching their head at, okay, what is my esports opportunity? So again, I think it was like a situation of the dominoes falling.
Yeah, and I think, so Jack in the Box is headquartered in San Diego, according to Google. So my guess is like that hits on most of the regions that they would want to be involved with. Just like if we were here in New York, I would definitely pick a New York brand, whether or not they were relevant to, Europe or South Korea or whatever. And certainly I think that that's a pretty strong spend, because I know that despite the thoughts that I have about like the Excelsior logo,
I like it. I hate to be the contrarian, but I really like the New York branding.
I think it's the context of it, where it seems like I am not a graphic designer, but for me, I look at things that I can put on a sticker and have like that immediate pride feeling to it. So I look at like the Dallas Fuels logo, and like that's pretty dope. The Gladiators, like all of them have been pretty great in their own right. Excelsior is sort of like almost the odd one out in that sense, where like the guy that found the shower curtains on IKEA or whatever, like I'm going to go buy those shower curtains now. And so I think that's a missed opportunity for the brand, but it's also something that I want to be able to put on a badge or on a bag or something, like, but I'm not going to wear that on a hoodie.
I mean, about the Gladiators logo. So I'm not sure if our listeners are familiar, but there's this CSGO team called North. They are owned by FC Copenhagen. And they're doing really well in Europe. And these two logos look surprisingly alike.
So that's happened multiple times in esports, and I think it happened last week in the Riot Mexico League, where they basically made one team rebrand because they stole a trademark logo from somebody else. Another one that was interesting, that was like way back in the day. I have two more elements of this. There was a team called I think it was Believe the Hype way back in the MLG days, and we found that they stole their logo from the Long Island minor league hockey team. And then another LCS one that was interesting was Vulcan. Vulcan actually stole their logo from the UN, where it's like, if you look at their logo, like the background is like cropped and pasted out of the UN logo, which I thought was like hilarious. I sent like Riot an email way back, and they're like, oh yeah, that does look the same.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess you can't expect us to know everything. But that is kind of a good point about like the maturity of our industry in general, of like now that you have a lot more dollars, a lot more scrutiny, a lot more expectations, like those types of things I think are going to come up significantly more frequently. And from an international perspective, it could get potentially kind of dicey, because you'll have teams that are all technically part of the same league, but in different jurisdictions. And that is something that I'm super interested to go watch. Whether or not it happens, I don't really know.
So yeah, no, I mean, that was a lot of interesting stuff coming out of the OWL as usual. And I think this kind of segues, we can segue to our next story. I don't know if it's a nice segue, but former WME-IMG executive director Tobias Sherman has created a game studio called Foundry 4. I think it's with co-founder Simon Abital and his wife Lisa Russo Sherman. All of those guys, I think, are coming from WME-IMG. and they're launching a new game studio with the aim to create competitive esports-focused title from the ground up. So we've seen this happen a lot, with titles like Infinite Crisis. We've seen it happen with Wave Dash, Shoot Mania. So it's a lot of, titles that are focusing on being an esport. We saw it most recently with Breakaway. Interestingly enough, Foundry 4 has gotten a seed round of investment from MGM Resorts International, and they're working through their Series A funding. The fact that it's MGM Resorts leads me to believe that there may be some casino integration. I know casinos have been hovering over esports for a while, trying to figure out how they can monetize it in the same way as poker. And finally, they said that franchise owners will get an equity stake in every game we develop and all revenue streams associated with it, whether it's sales on PC, sponsor partnership, media, or the league itself. I think personally that is, it's a great selling point to get teams like TSM involved, but I think you're kind of painting yourself into a box without actually having a product. So I would have felt I would have made that claim later on for maybe another beat of marketing as opposed to making it now. Mo, what do you think?
I mean, this is a question. Tyler, maybe you can answer. Has there been any time be a game that was particularly designed to be an esports that ended up being a successful esports title?
Not on purpose, I don't think.
No.
Like somebody was at BlizzCon and made the comment that like Blizzard has never on purpose made it successful.
That was Richard Lewis.
Yeah. So like those type of things I think are true as long as I can remember. Like there's plenty of games that have come out and said like we're going to do this, we're going to support a competitive thing, but sometimes that means that they forget to like make the game good. So there's a lot of elements that I think there are big question marks. However, to your point, I think it's really nice to at least know up front that whatever game they're going to come out with, whether it's a hit or a miss, has that underlying directive to say, we're going to be serious about this, we're going to treat it better. And I think a lot of those are lessons learned from Riot and certainly his time at WME.
Yeah, so here are the things that I really like about Foundry, and then I go into the things that I don't like as much. So I really like their business model, the fact that they get initial investors that will then have equity stake in every game and all the revenue streams that come from that. I think that's very unique for a studio not to go to venture capital, but they go to traditional sports teams, which might be teams that already have invested in esports teams. So let's say you're a Dallas Cowboy, you've invested in Complexity, now you buy a stake into this company. This company comes out with an esports title, throws a $500,000 tournament. Guess who's going to get a team that's going to compete in that league? Well, it's going to be Complexity. It's going to be Optic with their sports ownership. So that is really interesting, and I really, really like that. Obviously, a big plus are these people. I mean, they broke some very good ground, the WME IMG, and they really know the esports space really well from a brand perspective. Yeah.
I think one thing that it just came to me in sort of a thought that is potentially there is maybe the game doesn't have to necessarily be successful from a consumer standpoint. And by that, I mean, so if you think about traditional sports as a potential analogy, you have your dominant brands like the NFL, the NBA, obviously, everybody that's sort of at the pro level and across every major sport. But then at a more localized level with specific brands, you've got things like indoor football, even the Canadian Football League, a crazy amount of soccer leagues, the AAU, like a ton of things that have a pretty strong league. It may not be as breakout successful in terms of the billions of dollars that traditional athletics generates from any of the other brands that I mentioned. But I think because you have that captive audience with potential teams and that model, that might be enough. And it might just be able to diversify, and maybe it won't be a Riot or an Activision, but it could still make a pretty good impact.
That's absolutely true. And that's what I mentioned with their business model. But on the downside, I mean, this is a very good team when it comes to getting brands invested and getting these type of investments. It's going to be very key for them to hire actual good game developers.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at I think with the exception of Riot, I'm having a really hard time thinking of a publisher who had like a grand slam right out of the gate for their first title. Even Blizzard, they had their Lost Vikings game. If you look at like Bungie, they had, before they had Halo, they had Marathon, Myth, all those games where they kind of got their footing. I think that, in building a game now, it's, way more competitive than it's ever been before. You need the right distribution partners. You need, the right game developers. It's like, I think that, largely this feels like it was a situation where, based on their experience with WMEIMG and E-League, they saw how little control content creators had, or media partners. It's like, you're basically hoping, crossing your fingers, that Valve will give you the major. You're basically hoping that nobody will throw a tournament the same weekend that you're doing it. And in order to, to create that optimal product, you need to own the whole ecosystem. You need to own the game. You need to be a Riot. So it's not surprising they went with that strategic direction. At this point now, it's going to be entirely about the execution.
Yeah, I think you're going to run into like this interesting study almost of like a duality of potential paths you can take, where you can either go a Valve route where the community drives everything, right? So like whether it's a tournament that started, way back in the days, and now, something like ESL that obviously runs like the pro side for the most part anyways, which is all community driven, or you're going to go, their route, which seems to be a lot more brand and business oriented. And in that sense, because you control the game, you certainly have in-game purchasing options, different types of activations that maybe a Riot wouldn't put together, and maybe they'll be successful there. But I think it's the first time that you have the real potential and business know-how from Tobias's side to make that work. And so that's something that I'm really excited about. And I think the biggest question is it going to be something that maybe is very successful from a professional team and viewership, but ultimately maybe not even have that big of a player base?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that another interesting aspect of this is that if you look at any, tournament license, or, a lot of these RFPs that are getting slung around, one of the sponsors that you can never attach to anything in esports is gambling partners. So I think what was going on was that MGM saw that there was a limited amount of opportunities for them outside of basically, renting out their convention halls and hoping that people will attend, the slot machines. And, anecdotally, I have spoken to several representatives from Las Vegas where they haven't seen that much, crossover from the people attending, like, your Dream Hacks or your other esports or your Evos, and going out and gambling. So I think that, for them, okay, let's design a game that we can make put on the casino floor, and two, let's make a game and a property that we can attach our brand to as a sponsor and get visibility to get those people to come into Vegas for.
Yeah. And, just to go over to our next story, I think this is probably the most exciting story, adventurous story we've told before. Anton, you want to take the lead?
Sure. So we have KESPA. KESPA is an esports organization out of South Korea. They've been around for a really long time. And basically the South Korean police raided the KESPA, the Korean Esports Association's offices, and basically confiscated a bunch of things. The chairman and his aides are currently being investigated for receiving large payments from South Korean retail giant LOT Home Shopping and embezzling association funds. Prosecutors also seem to be investigating whether any sponsorship deals between KESPA and LOT were used as a means to influence Byung-hun, which includes the second season. Who's Byung-hun?
So Byung-hun, he is in the board of KESPA, and he actually is also on the broadcast board. So when LOT Home Shopping, their license got revoked. So basically they said that they might be able, by sponsoring KESPA tournaments, their fear was that maybe some of that money went to Byung-hun, and he might then be influenced to go and maybe give them that license back.
Got it. So he was basically a KESPA leader who was also a government leader, and they were trying to buy him out. Okay, that's interesting. So yeah, Tyler, from like a league perspective, what are all the red flags for you here? How what are the, what did they do wrong? I mean, obviously we know what they did wrong, but what are your thoughts on it?
I think there's a lot of layers to it, right? Because I think if you look at something like the NFL or the NBA here in the States, generally speaking, if you're involved in that, you might have a hand in other elements, but somebody like Adam Silver at the NBA is like the NBA commissioner, and that's his thing. And they have pretty strict rules and requirements and things about the potential conflict of interest that you might have as an employee, as somebody in a leadership position or whatever. That doesn't always extend to somebody like a team owner, but those elements are always things that you try to think of as you build out governance. Because even from us, when we think about the idea that we're sort of a fully integrated league, which includes everything from media and sponsorship down to the governance side of it and building infrastructure and whatever, there's a lot of points where if that's not properly managed and you don't have proper recourse for someone to go against that and say like, hey, this isn't right, or hey, we can't do this, that's a really slippery path. And so I think it always kind of starts with the mission of like, why does your organization exist? What is the purpose of your governance board, and what is its scope? And then making sure that internally as an organization, you have the proper elements and mechanisms to keep people honest around that. And then have the ability for outside audits and things like that, which is probably how this investigation started to some degree. But there's a lot of elements of thoughts around me as like a leader in our organization, trying to make sure that someone below me or whoever takes over as my predecessor as a chair doesn't have those potential temptations.
There's a theory in sports business that there's a perfect place where you do not have this type of stuff, this type of bribery. So in the beginning, when something starts up, let's say esports 10 years ago, esports right now, so maybe a year ago in some cases now, when it's young and people can be swayed for a lot of money, there is no bribery. There's a lot of bribery. You're a player, you don't have a lot of money to you might win $5,000 in a tournament. Someone comes to you and say, hey, I'm going to give you $5,000. The only thing you need to do is lose one game at this particular point. So you had a lot of that in esports in the beginning. Then comes the sweet spot. So then you'll have something like an NBA, like an NFL, where it's big, but it's not like an international huge organization. I'll come back later to talk what I'm talking about there. And then there's some corruption, but it's a lot less. And then finally you get to the point where something is so big and there's so many players that there is corruption, because you can go on the lower level and it's very easy to corrupt. And that's in the case of the Olympics. That's in the case of an NCAA. I don't want to target the NCAA, but I'm saying with regards to some of the things we heard with Adidas and like how they treat their players, there's room for that, because in NBA there are 12 teams, or there are 12 teams per, I don't know how many teams there are in the NBA, but there are a certain amount of teams. In something like the Olympics, like FIFA, with all their nation countries, there are so many players. Some players doing really, really well, some players not doing that well. So it's very easy to corruption to seep in. So I think it's going to be interesting, because I think esports is moving from that place one where there is a lot of corruption and a lot of these type of briberies to a place where you have franchising like the OWL or the LCS, where you have 12 teams in the league and everything is monitored really, really well, and the chance of corruption actually go down a lot. So that's one of the things I'm really excited to see.
Yeah, I'm almost in a way kind of glad that this happened, because it's in a position where everybody's still super hyped about everything from the Overwatch League and all the other elements that have been really positive esports stories. So as an industry, like, certainly this is not a good look, but it's a good time for it to happen. Marketing side of it is one piece of it, but more because as we start to see all this money flowing into esports and all these different leagues starting to go up, it's sort of that somber reminder of, if you're a Riot, if you're an Activision, even if you're us, making sure that you are watching for this type of thing, because I think there's so many things that have to be developed, whether it's a players association, whether it's the game itself, or just the elements of the league that you're generating. Sometimes things like this get forgotten, and it isn't until you have these types of events that it starts to become like, oh, I forgot about that, and that's really important. So I think that it's good to be prescient or aware of that danger now, rather than deal with it like 5 years from now.
I think it was really interesting when you touched upon governance and, the importance of it. What kind of structures do you have in place to basically govern your electronic gaming federation?
So for us, we set it up in a lot of ways the same way the NCAA does, in terms of how colleges are involved, how there's an element of self-reporting and different stats and checksums. Basically, we try to set this precedent for transparency. So whenever we as a governing body are looking at rule sets around how we interact with players, how we interact with universities, how we go through things like conduct cases, any element of money being involved in the system as we start to monetize media and elements of that. The idea is you just sort of make everything as available to everybody to look at and scrutinize and keep honest. Because if you look at, so I'll use the NCAA as an example just because it's what I'm most familiar with, but a lot of people would describe it as sort of this black box where no one really knows, what investigations are going to happen or even why in some areas. And as you go through those conduct processes, like there isn't a lot of communications between the universities and their players and the people. So that was sort of a core element for us. And then the other side is, I think from us as an organization, we look at the potential of eventually our league being its own entity, specifically to make sure that you try to build in whatever mechanisms you can to minimize the potential for scandal, essentially, whether it's, some element of corruption or some other thing that could happen. Inevitably, we know that we kind of get into those weird places where we want to make sure that our players are compensated. We want to make sure that everybody sort of has a buy-in that's appropriate for their level. They sort of reduces the potential that they're going to go out and try to do something like this. But that's built into a lot of what we do. Otherwise, a lot of it's coming down to how we interact with universities and try to instill that culture of decency and trying to identify the factors that are going to look at it and say, here's some weak points that we have as an organization that someone might try to exploit. So there's definitely a lot of layers to it. I know from our perspective, we always tell every college, every student, every government that we work with that we don't have all the answers yet. We kind of have an idea of, where things could go wrong and the elements that we want to build out as a core. But that's why we start with a framework rather than trying to build out, this 1,000-page document that covers everything.
And I definitely think that in the current state of, esports, basically to have an evolving structure is probably a better strategy than to, come out of the gates with, rules set in stone. This whole thing is just so much more different than, any other traditional sport that, to basically make a guess and then just be beholden to it indefinitely is really, really rough.
It's also kind of interesting because there's a lot of stakeholders involved because for us, colleges and students are one element of it, potential brands that get involved in making sure that, you don't ever want to become a toxic brand, right? Because it obviously destroys a lot of revenue channels for you. But also when we look at our interactions with publishers, for instance, like they certainly have standards that we have to uphold because we're using their IP. So I think in some ways there's a better potential for checks and balances so long as those relationships are built earlier, as opposed to like a new basketball league that's starting up because you can basically do whatever you want there. And so I hope that we do a good job of, sort of leading the elements of what we consider strong governance points, and that everybody that's looked at, the corruption that's happened in any number of sports leagues or now with KESPA having that experience and being able to say, these are choices that they made that led to this, because we can look at that retrospective of, 50 or 100 years and try to make better choices.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing I always like about hearing you talk about the Electronic Gaming Federation, about the work you're doing, is that you're refreshingly honest and that you know the strong points of your organization, but more importantly, you know the growth that you can have. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about the work you're doing. And before we go more into depth, about the EGF, the last story I think we want to touch today is we wouldn't justify being an esports business podcast if we not mention two of this year's biggest esports events happened this weekend: the Overwatch World Cup and the League of Legends World's Finals. So let's go through these numbers because that's pretty interesting. So the Overwatch League World Cup managed to reach 1.5 million unique viewers and a peak concurrent viewership of 325K. The hours watched for the previous 4 weeks averaged at about 2.5 million hours. This week it was at about 5.7 million hours, so that's an increase of roughly 130%. So these numbers, by the way, all come from TNL's stats. So League of Legends peak concurrent viewership surged to 27% to reach 1.1 million concurrents. However, total hours watched fell by 9%, hours streamed dropped by 12%, and average concurrence sank by 10%. And perhaps what might be most important, the fans watched on average about an hour less this year at Worlds than compared to last. So this is pretty interesting. So on one hand, we have Worlds, which is the biggest esports tournament in the world, that's doing a little less. It could be because there are 2 Korean teams in the finals that obviously might take away some American viewership. On the other hand, we have the Overwatch World Cup shattering what contenders did before. There are a couple reasons for that, I think. Number one is it was the first time they had in-client reach to these tournaments, which obviously leads to a lot of casual viewership. But they maintained this strong viewership throughout the tournament. I think they've done a really good job with their client, which obviously helps a lot. Tyler, I know not only are you a big Overwatch fan, you were also at BlizzCon. So I would love to hear your 2 cents.
It was amazing. And I say that because, so I've been to Worlds, I've been to, Overwatch competitions, I've been to StarCraft, like Counter-Strike, ESL, like all those types of things. The energy and consistent crowd that was there, cheering for our teams regardless of, what country you came from was an experience that I honestly don't think that I felt, because there was sort of a difference between cheering for the USA or cheering against South Korea than cheering for, a brand like Fnatic or Cloud9 or something in a CSGO tournament, where when they go out, those fans often leave and don't come back. So I think from an in-person experience, it was really awesome. And I saw people go out and buy insane numbers of jerseys like after they watched the first match. And that was something that I think was a really strong point of that. Then if we started to look at the major changes from last year to this year that made really significant impacts, certainly the spectator client is something that everyone loves to beat up on, but they made significant improvements to improve that broadcast quality. I don't think it's perfect by any means, but it's definitely made it significantly easier for someone like myself to follow what's happening. They added a lot more storytelling to it, although I think they could go a lot further towards, more of Olympic style. But having like stats repacked and come up and say, Flower did this amount of damage versus, the other team, those were cool elements that added a lot of substance.
Yeah, but did they have a dragon?
Yeah, they did not have a dragon. Well, no, actually, that's not true. Their opening ceremonies did have the, whatever her name is from Heroes of the Storm, I think is where she was introduced. So yeah, but not the cool stuff.
Although Alex Straza?
It was Alex Straza, yeah. Because it was Hanzo and the 2 dragons. That was something that was really cool. I think that overall BlizzCon was super strong on esports in general, to the point where I think the only criticism I would have of that entire event was if you weren't there for esports, there wasn't a lot for you. Like there were developer panels and things like that, and some merchandises and some demos. But overall, it sort of fell into that trap of most esports events where otherwise it feels pretty sterile. But the production quality was great. I was glad to see the viewership go up as high as it was. I think they've built a really strong foundation for, now they've gotten to a point where it's little things like explaining the rules of, a control point versus a hybrid map versus an assault or something like that. So definitely really strong. I'm glad that, it kind of came out as a proving point to say, I know that viewership has been dropping with contenders and everything else, and I think some of that might have been the strangling of community-based events that, were pretty strong for a while, and PUBG and other things coming out. So I think the biggest question going forward in my mind is, this is a World Cup thing, so it's, obviously pretty brand agnostic. It's focused on countries. It involves a lot of different people. I want to see whether or not that momentum carries over into the Overwatch League and whether people care about Excelsior versus the Shock versus as opposed to South Korea versus the USA.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that Overwatch made a lot of giant strides. And Mo kind of threw out a bunch of numbers at the beginning of this segment. And, I guess the quick summary would be that Overwatch went up, League of Legends went down in the West. You got to look at those numbers from a lens, though. I mean, this last year's League of Legends World Finals, they were held in Los Angeles. Having an event on the West Coast pretty much guarantees that you're going to get incredible viewership, right? The event doesn't last too late. It's like, perfect timing. And this year it was in Beijing. I mean, the time difference to get up and watch all those games, I mean, it's an effort. Like, you have to set your alarm. You're not just going to turn it on and see it. So the fact that it only went down 10%, who cares? I mean, I bet you Riot expected that. I bet you Riot's goal by having this event in Beijing, having the whole qualifier process in China, was to basically peak their Chinese numbers. And the Chinese numbers that I saw said that there was something like 100 million unique people that tuned in through the course of the event. So, I mean, to compare, like, okay, to have this narrative that, like, oh, League of Legends went down, I think that's totally unfair.
That's true. You're completely right. And just to go a little bit further, even, I think the finals were, what was it? Like, it was very early in the morning in New York.
It was like
in the morning.
It was like, I don't think it was 5 in the morning. I think that the finals finished around like 10 a.m. So I guess maybe, yeah. Oh, and the other one that I thought was really interesting, they're in an outdoor stadium and it was 34 degrees. That was like freezing. Like, I mean,
but the crowds that you saw in that stadium were insane. Like, I was sitting there watching Overwatch and people were sending me pictures of like the desk in the stadium and things like that. And I almost didn't believe that I honestly thought they were photoshopped at first, because the amount of people that just did not care that showed up to watch the Dragon, it was just...
Could you see the Dragon if you were in the stadium? No.
I don't think
No,
so.
I think it was only on stream. Yeah. That's what I thought. Yeah.
Worth it. From my perspective, whatever. I don't care about that.
We saw the Dragon at 10 a.m. or 5 a.m. in the morning.
It kind of worked out really well for me, because like, you imagine going to BlizzCon, like, you're not going to bed until like 4 or 5 in the morning. So it's like, all right, we can catch all these games and stuff like that. I think it was really funny to like be at a hotel bar at whatever time it was, and you'd have
the Hilton,
the Marriott, all of those. They were really Blizzard centric, obviously being at BlizzCon, but then you had like groups of people like huddled around a cell phone watching Samsung just dominate SKT, and everyone's like, there were people that were crying, like people were like, I love Faker and all those types of things. So it was a really cool crossover between the two. And I don't think that would have happened if like there weren't just a bunch of super drunk people, super late at night trying to figure out where they were.
I don't want to attribute this tactic to the wrong coach, but I think the other interesting success story here with Samsung was when they were rebuilding that team, when they were building that team, the coach would not hire anybody who asked the question of how much I would get paid. He only recruited people who were basically, I'm here to win. I thought that was really interesting. And I think it was Samsung, not SKT, right? Can anybody confirm? All right.
Could be. Well,
I believe you.
Just the last thing I want to say about the World's Finals is, so there was this moment at the end. Samsung Galaxy beat SKT. Faker was crushed, and he cried in front of his computer, and it was this incredible moment. I mean, I'm not a big league fan. I play it once a year when I feel like I'm trying to get in, and then I realize I need to play this 10 hours a week in order to even understand it remotely.
Yeah.
But what I did really like, I rewatched that moment like 4 or 5 times, and I think we saw a lot of esports fans that were kind of angry or confused why Riot would show that. And I think that this is really interesting, because I think the audience is going to see a shift in what an esports broadcast will be. Because before, it was very cringy. It was obviously very, do it yourself. So when someone cries, they would run behind behind the stage, and no one would see them. But once you're moving into the mainstream, once you're franchising, once all these millions of dollars are coming in and you're aiming for a more mainstream audience, these type of moments not only grab the audience, an audience that might not be too familiar with League of Legends, but they make sure that there is a storyline next year. How much more powerful is the return of Faker next year? Like, you can show that moment over and over again, and you can say like, oh, he beat that team, and if they meet Galaxy again, that's going to be the most watched game in the history of League.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, if Faker's reaction to that loss was a bigger story than Samsung beating SKT, which if you had told me that going in, I would have said that you were absolutely crazy, because the idea that SKT could lose was something that just didn't seem possible. And so I think that from a perspective of esports getting into it, I think to games like the Super Bowl or anything that has a similarly high stakes in a different element, those are really common reactions to watch. Like, you're going to see a quarterback just like break down in tears because they let their team down. You'll see people do all sorts of crazy stuff. I mean, like, being a Bills fan, like, when we lose, we tear stadium things apart and start throwing them into the parking lot. So, a little bit different emotional reaction to that. And maybe I kind of mentioned the sterility of esports events previously. I think that some of those elements might be a way to make them more human in a way, which I think is really important.
No, I definitely agree with, showing Faker crying. I think that, there's a situation for a safe place and there's a situation that's not for a safe place. And I think, when you are playing that game, it's almost like, there was maybe a little bit of a controversy a couple of weeks ago when the Immortals player refused to give an interview. And I think that's a little bit different than, crying after a game. I definitely agree with showing Faker. I have my other opinions on that situation previously. Anyway, so moving away from League of Legends, this wasn't really a formal story, but with the end of the year coming up, you're seeing a lot of companies report numbers. And I thought that there were a couple of really interesting things that came out. There was 3 companies that had really great years. One of them that everybody's aware of is PUBG. They sold 20 million copies. The other one that had a great year is Tencent and Epic Games with their release of Fortnite. Fortnite just crossed 20 million. So while there's probably not as many people watching it on Twitch, I know that they're definitely catching up. They definitely have the active user base. And in a couple of these random podcasts, me and Mo have pretty much agreed on this one statement that we stole from another VC investor. But the Tencent model right now is we're either going to buy you for X or we're going to spend 10X to build and copy you. And, right now that strategy is becoming increasingly effective.
And Tencent just announced that they're releasing basically a PUBG clone for mobile.
Yeah, and mobile is going to be huge. Mobile, your barrier of entry is like nothing. And finally, the other one that I think is a really big success, there's a lot of, shooters out there. And the one title that nobody's really talking about right now is Rainbow Six, who just crossed the 25 million mark. And if you think about it, okay, Overwatch last year, for this giant Blizzard title, I think maybe it was a month or 2 months ago, they just crossed their 35 million mark. But you have right now this giant ramp for Rainbow Six that's crawling up. And I guess my one prediction for 2018 is that you're going to see some big new titles that are going to catch people by surprise outside of PUBG, outside of League of Legends, outside of Counter-Strike, outside of Dota 2. And I think it's going to be one of those years where you are going to see new titles in the esports, top 5, top 6.
I hope so. And one thing that I really love is the challenge that PUBG brings to me as an organizer. Because if you could imagine a game like Counter-Strike, you have a team versus a team. It's 10 people on a server. Overwatch is 12. PUBG is 100. So when we think about how we run matches, you can't just do like a Georgia Tech versus UT Austin. But it kind of creates a new challenge, and then it has the numbers to back it up.
Do you do any PUBG?
We do some community events as part of other groups. We haven't run anything ourselves yet. But we're thinking about what would it be like if you could take an entire campus and then take 50 people from one college, 50 from another, and just like see what happens, which is kind of an exciting thing because it sort of breaks away from that very standardized element of how you look at gaming. But the other element, and something that I'm really glad I definitely did not buy into Fortnite originally. Like, I am a PUBG player through and through. I came over from Counter-Strike. I have an intense loyalty to that. I think a lot of it has to do with my friend group. But we played Fortnite for a while, and certainly there's some novel elements of it. But the one thing that I noticed that actually makes it easier for us in the college and high school space is it's more content friendly, which I think is one thing that may actually give it more staying power than I would have expected, where the violence is more cartoony. It's something that we might actually be able to get away with in putting some of the context we use.
Yeah, and primarily when you're looking at colleges, as you mentioned, it's free to play, which is so important because if you're a college, if you have a community night, right, you can bring in so many more people if it's free to play. Because even if you've never played it, like, it's like you just hop on a computer or a PlayStation and like just play it.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot easier to give it a shot. I mean, I know that from like a developer perspective, there's a ton of studies that say like if you charge for your game and they buy into it, they'll spend a lot more money in in-game content afterwards. And certainly like Overwatch takes that. Almost any Blizzard game that when it came out took that route. Very different than League and other elements of it, but I think that incidental is really important.
Yeah, I mean, some of the numbers that we're seeing right now is that publishers have pivoted from making the majority of their money from in-game to making the majority of their money from in-game purchases, and I think that both of those titles will facilitate that. The legality of loot boxes remains to be seen, and the longevity of how long those will be around. But I do think that the GAS, what we can call the gas model, is here to stay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now we've gone through all the stories this week. I just wanted to go in a little bit in depth about the work Tyler is doing, because I think, Anton, you agree it's very needed, and it's work that breaks ground for this whole industry. So, I mean,
yeah, no, I mean, 100% to Mo's point. And one of my mentors, Adam Apicella, one of the things that he always, went on and on about was, the feeder systems. It's like, with football, with all these traditional sports, you have these, high school leagues, and you have these college leagues that, allow things like the MLB and the NFL to exist. And Tyler's, building a critical piece of infrastructure somewhat successfully, some would say very successfully. It's interesting to hear like your perspective, how's it going over there in, college and high school land?
It changes every day, which is in the best way possible. Like I always tell the story of, so when we started, I've been in esports since I was 10, running Counter-Strike teams and tournaments and things like that through high school and into college, ultimately running tournaments for college students. And when we went to make a business out of this, we were still in school and still taking business classes and things like that. And when we decided to use it as a school project at one point, they made us go out and call 150 people that we thought were potential customers. So for us, that means everybody from a student to a university president to an athletic director, take their feedback, understand, what it is, and then decide, how to build your business. And at that point, I would say probably 80 to 90% of them were either completely ignorant of what esports were and were kind of uninterested in the engagement aspect of it, or they were outright hostile. And that has changed.
And they've all since been fired?
No, they've all called me back.
And when 80 or 90% of them were hostile, that was the moment when Tyler knew he struggled.
Yeah, well, I remember like going back to my professor and being like, well, it seems like everybody hates my idea. I'm still going to do it. And he was like, okay, sure. So I think there was it was a really fun time for us to like go out and make a bunch of mistakes and, be told that we were wrong. And now we get to a point where, there's now more than 45 colleges that offer scholarships, and there's a bunch of other stuff that kind of happens even despite our efforts in the space. So from an overall status perspective, we launched our partnership with the state of Connecticut at the end of September to do high school stuff. We're working a lot in a bunch of other states around the country. We work primarily with like big D1 athletic schools. So we haven't announced anything like that, but in the spring we'll be able to talk about a bunch of really cool stuff going on there. And something I've been watching a lot more closely is what happens abroad. So looking at India, which has schools with esports courses, the UK, which has Newell and some other aspects of competitive development, all the way to the Masters series in Europe. All those elements are kind of showing the rest of the world what's possible. Our perspective has always been those are amazing things that need to happen, and our goal is to sort of consolidate and make more efficient. To the point where a college has everything that they need if they want to get into the space. Same thing with the high schools, and then ultimately give the ability to go interact with, whether it's a publisher or a pro league.
It's kind of like an anecdotal thing. I just feel like, we're in an open market economy, and there are winners and there are losers. And one of, the bigger losers right now that's getting a little bit of negative press is football and the risks that it poses. Are you seeing more schools that are looking for an alternative to their, potentially, programs that are you seeing more schools get interested in esports as football is experiencing this growing stigma?
It's actually kind of funny because traditional sports only ever comes up as an analogy for what we do. So in every high school that we've talked to, and we're well into the hundreds in that perspective, our sample size and groups that we talk to, they see it as something that works in parallel. So they don't necessarily look at it as an either or. They're just seeing the same thing that any parent or, anybody that has a nephew or a niece or anything like that sees, which is, that kid is playing Minecraft, they're watching YouTube videos, they're spending a lot of time on Twitch. They care a lot more about that digital world than, something like playing baseball. So while it's not necessarily a direct correlation to that, I imagine it's definitely a factor. But generally, the motivation is from an administrator perspective, regardless of what generation you're a part of. Your job is to engage your students and provide the best possible experience and kind of go where they are. So when we do it, we look at esports as a platform. So using one element being competition and running the leagues and such. But we spend a lot of time with education, inclusivity, and diversity, and mental health, and a bunch of other stuff, which they see as sort of this driver for a lot of things that they wouldn't be able to do for a population that, frankly, some of them didn't even know existed or that they should be paying attention to them before.
I don't want to get too granular, but I guess one of the bigger differences between traditional sports and esports is Twitch is an incredibly dominant content distribution platform. I also know that they've had a lot of college efforts working with you guys, working with other partners. What are the thoughts of the universities and some of these schools in terms of the media aspect of this business?
I think that it's really early for all of them. So I think one of the big misconceptions that some of people have brought up to us is, frankly, like in college esports, there just isn't a lot of money right now because you don't get the 2.5 million people that are watching Overwatch, coming into the college space yet. It's still super underdeveloped. A lot of people don't even know how to talk about esports. And so not surprisingly, but a big element of what we do is educationally based and focused on awareness. So when we think about the media aspect of it, colleges kind of look at it from a perspective of someday this is going to be something that they want to put, that type of element, and they want to monetize and they want to turn it into the machine that it should be, or at least we think that it could be. And the most important thing to me is they want to do it in the right way. So I mentioned before, like the idea of paying players, maybe not a salary, but certainly like a portion of something that comes through from that is something that we drive really hard. And surprisingly to me, when you think about a college that's super dominant in football, which is obviously NCAA, come to us and say, hey, we want to build something new because we've seen this 100 years of history and traditional athletics with the NCAA. We're ready to do something that's a little bit different, and we think this is the best way to give it a shot.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I love picking your brain about this because Mo had a lot of hypotheses and theories about how this whole thing is going to work out. Another one that him and I are pretty much in alignment on is that you're going to see some players who pursue their professional career first and then go to college. Have we have any case studies or samples like that?
Not in practice yet, with some exception of people that have come back to be coaches for some of the varsity programs that exist. So there are sort of elements. The way that we look at it is essentially understanding that if you look at a foundational aspect, you can look at high school to college to pro the same way you would in traditional athletics, and that's possible. There are certain elements of being a college player first that a team might like from your independency level, so being able to do your own laundry and understand how the world works a little bit, and then there's obviously the maturity aspect of it, which can be impactful. On the other hand, if you have somebody that's the age of Flower, for instance, he's only 17, he definitely should be an OWL as soon as he's eligible to do so, and he would be a high school student here in the US at that age. So we look at it as here's an opportunity for somebody in high school to go directly to a pro team. And if they want to go back to the college because they retire at the age of 21 or 22, they have every aspect to do it. And we've been working on colleges providing an opportunity, whether it probably won't be as a player, because I think at that point, if you've retired, you don't want to.
Honestly, it's I would love to see some ex-pros go and play for college teams. And I think the universities would as well. All of a sudden, it's okay, it's not that you're hiring an amateur. You're hiring somebody who can, bring a giant and developed audience to your school.
Yep.
And that's the big difference between traditional sports and esports. The fact that in traditional sports, if you have professional experience, you by definition are not able to play for a college. So if you are a soccer player and you play in Europe for 2 years, found out that you cannot have a career, Harvard wants to give you a scholarship, they are not allowed because you used to be a professional player, which obviously takes away a lot of potential to get good players, but also up the quality of the viewership and everything like that. And that's something that we can see in esports, and it can become a safe haven for a lot of pros.
Yeah, and I mean, as a first principle thinker, I think everybody wins in that situation. Tyler, I'll let you tell me the downsides of my scenario in a second. But again, it's like the school gets more exposure, the pro gets an education, after they've spent some time in the real world and they kind of, have a better idea of what they want to do. I mean, I feel like, this would be a huge win for esports and schools.
Yeah, and I agree. And I mean, even if it's not from into a player perspective of someone coming back and playing for college because maybe they just literally don't want to play that game anymore, they can come back and work as staff, and that's an opportunity to get something like a graduate assistantship or some other form of scholarship, which solves a lot of the problems that we have in terms of staffing. Like finding experienced people to run those programs is pretty difficult. So that's one element. I think the only potential downside I'm sure there are more than even I think of right now, but I think the biggest point that someone would make is if you can imagine someone like Faker coming to college in the US, obviously dominant player in League of Legends forever. He's a name that everybody knows whether you've ever watched a League of Legends match or not. If he decided to go to Stony Brook, for instance, I'm sure there would be people that would say that's incredibly unfair. He's the best player in the world. We haven't seen anybody else like him in our lifetime yet. And so there's a competitive integrity, I guess, maybe, but at the same time, I don't have any stats to show that that's the case. And it might not make a difference because all these games are team games. So, there's definitely a big element of that. So I think this is definitely one of those cases where I fully admit to not having the entire answers. I have a theory for us in terms of how we want to make sure people can move in and out of this system to the best possible impact for those students. But it may very well be that we try this and it turns out people abuse the system horribly and we need to reform it or whatever. But at least we want to give it a shot, like I said.
Cool. So, I think, Tyler, I want to thank you so much for coming. Guys, this has been Esports Boom, episode 12. Tyler, where can people follow you?
You can follow us on Twitter at @officialegf or me, T Schrodt. And if I may, I always like to plug my favorite company in the world before I leave. It's Anxiety Gaming out in California. They do a bunch of amazing stuff with mental health, and Jason Docton is one of my favorite people on this planet. So if you know someone struggling with mental health challenges or anything like that, please go to their website and check them out. And certainly happy to help facilitate if I can.
How can you not like this guy?
I actually was at a panel earlier this week with Tyler, and he really does plug them everywhere he goes.
I can't help it. I mean, like from my perspective, they're one of the things that people may not talk about because you get caught up in the fact that the Cowboys are investing or whatever. But everything that we do is all about community, right? Whether you're a pro team, whether you're an organizer, whether you're an organization like us. And I think that the most important thing is to take care of your people. And so the people that are willing to put in incredibly hard work to tackle a challenge like that deserve that. And it's something that's really close to my heart. So I'm really glad that they exist.
So just because Tyler did this, so I will take the lead and I'll donate some money to Anxiety Gaming. I'll urge all of our listeners to do the same. Anton, where can people find you?
People can find me on Twitter at JokerCan'tSpell.
And you can find me at MREISENMANN. Thank you very much for listening.
And guys, if you've made it this far into the podcast, please do us a favor. If you appreciate all of our insight, if you want to support us and show your love, head on over to iTunes, write a review. And if you enjoyed the podcast, we'd be really honored if you gave us a 5-star review.